Hello, classmates. So for my presentation, I decided to do Chapter 12, International Business and Globalization. I actually found this chapter a lot more interesting than I was expecting it to. So for my discussion case, I found H&M Factories. So H&M is a Swedish company that outsources clothing manufacturing to sweatshops in Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Cambodia. In recent years, clothing consumers have realized that many fast fashion brands use child labor sweatshops, taking advantage of countries where these are legal. In 2016, investigative journalists found that Swedish clothing company H&M had been using sweatshop labor and dangerous work conditions in these countries to create their clothing. Fast fashion companies such as H&M want cheap labor, but since they cannot achieve this in their own country, they move their factories to countries that do not hold the same ethical standards. I have a video, just a small part of this video. Just a moment. Nope.
These people have
not yet. Oops. Sorry.
H&M just doesn't have the time.
What we're really talking about here, Nick, is U.S. companies exploiting cheap labor costs in developing countries. Who cares if they sign some agreement? Doing an agreement like this, I mean, it's not even enforceable for that matter. It's a PR stunt. I'm glad that these people have work and the ability to sustain themselves with companies, but they're exploiting cheap labor costs in these developing nations. That's what this is about. I mean, real reform would either be following the regulations put in place here in the U.S. and actually employing people here, or B, making real changes and matching, giving these people a living wage, first of all, which in a lot of cases, come on. And secondly, the safety standards, they're going around OSHA, because in the U.S., obviously we can't do this. So this is exploitation at its most predominant for me.
Right, and the fact that they're misleading to their customers, the very people that are making them the money, the people buying this, they have these recycle stations in their stores, right, where you bring in your old clothes and it makes you feel like you're doing something good for the environment. They have their whole sustainability campaigns, and they're just painting the wrong picture. And they've told people, they've come out after this whole the study was released, and they told people that, oh no, we're in the middle of reforming, everything's good now, we're all good, and they're simply lying, because they don't want people to know the truth, and they don't want to look bad, right? They want people to go and buy their clothes and not think about where these clothes are coming from and who's dying or who's being put in these dangerous situations so that we can wear these t-shirts. They don't want people to start thinking about that. Now, H&M was in the news recently because they started this, they had this, apparently it was this brand new kind of breakthrough sort of advertising where they used a model wearing a hijab, and that was the first time that anyone had used that in the fashion industry. And I'm thinking now that this came out, that they were using that to divert attention off of this study that they knew was going to be all over the media, and a lot of people were going to be talking about it. So while they're starting these sustainability campaigns where you could recycle the clothes, while they're doing these sort of commercials showing models in hijabs to kind of paint themselves as this sustainable kind of breakthrough company, they're also doing terrible things that we just don't even know about, and it made me
Okay, so
automatically think of American Eagle.
Okay, so to start our chapter, Chapter 12 is about how companies and organizations choose to act when in different companies. The phrase "when in Rome" is used as an ideology in this situation. When in countries where there is not a minimum wage or laws against child labor, companies may be compelled to do as the Romans do. This chapter exposes some of the ethical issues involved in this ideology. Okay, so first section. In earlier chapters, we have discussed relativism, which is the idea that different people have differences in perception and consideration. The American point of view of how workers should be treated is different than how, for example, China's point of view is of how workers should be treated. A major question is raised: if a country has laws that goes against your company's values, are you willing to compromise your values to accept theirs or refuse their business? In H&M's case, when they were presented with the options for labor, they chose a location where they where they could have cheap labor as well as not as many rules in place to keep those workers safe. They could use the excuse that they were just being respectful for how that company handled business. Ethical relativism does not change the ethics expected of that company, but challenges the strength of their integrity. Even though ethical relativism exists, it doesn't mean that there is not a set of basic values that every culture has. The textbook talks about a philosopher, Tom Donaldson, who has two approaches to how companies can exist in other cultures. There is the minimalist and the maximalist way of thinking. In the minimalist approach, the company would perform its basic duties but cause no harm to the communities it exists in. The maximalist approach is that a company has the responsibility to be a positive outlet and support the communities where it exists. Alright, so next one. The Ruggie framework is a type of minimalistic approach explained by the The Ruggie framework is a type of minimalistic approach that is explained best by its motto: protect, respect, and remedy. The government's job is to protect the people, and therefore the company had no responsibility to that. The company's job is to respect the government's rules. Consumers have the right to have their problems remedied. This poses ethical issues, however. Companies in this situation are able to abuse this, and it is not clearly stated what the company will protect the rights of if the company will protect the rights of its workers. What rights should a worker have? Tom Donaldson also came up with a list of these rights that all humans should possess. And the list of his human rights. All humans should have the right to freedom of physical movement, ownership of property, freedom from torture, fair trial, non-discriminatory treatment, physical security, freedom of speech and association, minimal education, political participation, and subsistence. In past years, globalization and international business was not important in business ethics. This is not the case now, as we know that business can cause global influence. Globalization is the expansion of a business's influence globally. It creates a faster way of moving human labor, technology, goods, and services across the world. This is why international business ethics is important. Globalization erases borders and therefore makes business easier and faster. The hope is that with this faster trade, wealth will be spread and conflicts will be less likely to happen, benefiting all countries. There is an opposition, however. Globalization harms the poor, encourages a race to the bottom in environmental and ethical parts in business. It undermines equal rights and self-determination, and lastly, violates a duty of national loyalty. First up, that is the opposition. First up, globalization and the poor. The first opposition is the fear that better integrated economies and trade will not improve the standard of living for the poor. In globalization, businesses want to make more faster, which is why they would need more labor and supplies. The more labor, the more expensive it is to pay that labor. Businesses look for cheaper labor in countries that allow for a very low wage for workers. By moving their factories to a different country, the lowest workers of those previous factories would lose their jobs. This causes two situations. The employees from the previous factory in the home country will be unemployed and looking for work, and the employees that work in the new factory are underpaid and work in sweatshop conditions. A solution for this would be if the business figured out what the price of living would be for in that country and pay those workers a minimum wage. The next opposition, race to the bottom, refers to how countries are taking away and limiting the rules of production, environmental rules, and labor rules in order to seduce more businesses in these countries. It's pressure caused by the competition to make things faster and cheaper. The production is expensive when there are safety regulations, environmental regulations, a livable wage, and regulation for the safety of their products as well. The race to the bottom is referring to this struggle. Another way this happens is in free trade agreements. For example, if America were to ban the trade of a product that was harmful to the environment, different countries in their trade agreement would challenge them as an unfair barrier to free trade. This causes a lapse in progress. When governments try to put in place environmental standards or regulations to keep workers safe, other countries who are affected by these may believe it is unfair to free trade, or companies within those governments may feel it is restrictive to their business. There are two sides to this. Companies that are trying to keep up with other companies as competition goes, but in doing so they are creating ethical issues regarding workers and the environment. The government and safety organizations try to make sure that these workers have their rights and try not to destroy the environment, but this impedes the countries trying to keep up. The solution to this would be that because it is a free market, it should have regulations to not endanger its workers. All markets would have to agree on basic regulations for their workers and on environmental issues. This connects back to the minimalistic approach, do no harm, but instead of the companies doing this, it would be international regulations of workers' rights. Oops. The next opposition is the fear that globalization undermines democracy and that in certain organizations are able to make regulations on trade without outside input. The example that is used in the book is the World Trade Organization. They are an intergovernmental organization that regulates the trade of 164 member states. The fear is that they would have too much control, especially over smaller, poorer countries. For example, the World Trade Organization could undermine small countries' governments by just going over their heads. The other side of this argument is that a country that wants to be supported by these types of trade organizations has to respect the rules that come with that support. There is also the fear that since these organizations have so much control, that they also control the politics of these countries as well. The support for these organizations believe this is not a negative thing, however. These organizations want better regulations on safety and health of workers, as well as environmental issues. If regulating the trade to these countries makes them enforce better worker rights and environmental health, it is positive for that country. Individual countries formed and joined these organizations for the reason of better international trade. The last is the issue of national loyalty. It's the fear that globalization will decrease companies' loyalty to their home country. Companies seduced by the lower cost of production move their factories to other countries. The ethical issues of national loyalty of businesses is that there is a lack of support back into the society. Economics is a circle of supply and demand, as seen by this chart that we've all probably seen. If all production in the U.S. was outsourced to other countries, the U.S. unemployment would skyrocket. U.S. citizens would not be able to pay for the products that these outsourced companies would create and would lead to a decreased economy. There are a few criticisms on this viewpoint. First, next slide. First, if U.S. citizens were only paid for American-made things, they would have to spend more money for less, leading to less monetary circulation. Secondly, it undermines the free trade agreements that the U.S. has with other countries. The third is that just because a country has its headquarters moved to another country does not mean that they do not support all the communities their locations are in. Think of international food chains such as McDonald's and Starbucks. Their headquarters are in the United States, but all of their locations support the communities that they are in. If their headquarters were to change to a different country, would it change the amount of support these locations have? The fourth is that no country is entirely self-sufficient, and therefore the companies within those countries should not be forced to be either. World trade is necessary for many supplies across the country. Where do we get oil or gasoline? What about new technology or medication? International trade is a necessity sometimes. It does not mean that U.S. should not be more self-reliant and create more U.S. jobs, but that shouldn't restrict companies to not be forced to expand. Here are the questions I have for you. Do you believe in the minimalist or maximalist approach, and why? Globalization has both pros and cons. Are there any not listed here or in the text that you could think of? And 3, of the 4 cons of globalization we've talked about, what do you believe to be the most potentially dangerous? Thank you for listening and have a nice night.